Hello, hello. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. And welcome to our panel. This is the front-end innovation, the fast and the curious. So I'm really excited to be here today and very happy to be joined by four very special guests. I've been at Rakuten for 10 years. I've been in Japan for 15. Originally, I was an engineer. I was a full-stack web engineer. And I really made my mark with JavaScript on the front end. But this was about 10 years ago when jQuery was the biggest thing. So I know a lot of things have moved on since then, and we have the right people here to lead us through that. So I'd like to do quick introductions of our panelists today. If I can get this thing to work. Every time. Okay, this clicker's not working. Could somebody help, please? Our front end is messing up already. Okay, well, we'll do this without the slides. Firstly, we have Luca Mugnaini. He's from Rakuten. He's our very own front-end engineer here, originally hailing from Italy. He is an Elm enthusiast, evangelist, and he brings a little bit of extra, a lesser known but very powerful framework. So we're very happy to have him on the panel. Oh, so much that. Following that, we have damn it.
Maybe they can just flip from...
Yeah, I'll just say next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, next up we have Sacha Greif. So Sacha is based in Kyoto, where he's working at a company called Zens. But he's really famous in the community for creating the State of JavaScript website, the State of CSS website, and also author of the Vulcan Framework. So very happy to have him here with us today. Next slide, please. Thank you. The next is Michael Rhambo. He's also traveled up from Osaka today, where he's working at a company called Medman. But his main contribution here is the Best of JS website. So we will have some, also coming from France here. So welcome. And lastly but not least, we have Manvi Kapoor. She's also from Rakuten. She is a front-end engineer, full stack, a Vue and Angular enthusiast as well. So quick round of applause for the panels. So. Thank you. So we're going to be talking about a few topics. Basically, we've only got 40 minutes. So after the session, we have a fireside chat in a different room. We'll lead you there. So if you have questions, please save them for that session. We'll cover topics around the complexity, around trends, and maybe get some tips and tricks from the people in the know here while we do that. But before we start, just a quick show of hands. In the audience, who here is a front-end engineer? Please put your hand up. Okay. Who here wants to be a front-end engineer? Okay. And who here is just here waiting for the next session? All right, cool. Okay. Well, with that, let's start the panel. And I'd like to ask the first question. So with my previous experience coming into the front-end world now, looking at all of the different libraries and frameworks and the things available, it's actually extremely complex. So I'd like to hear from the panel, what, as someone who's beginning, where should they start? And I think because Manvi, you're the youngest on the panel, maybe this is most relevant for you.
Okay, so I would say if someone's looking to join the front-end world, So welcome first. Welcome for the welcome world to blast upon you. And if you are working independently, if you're not working in a company, I would say to get started, like maybe either you can work on a personal project a problem that you would really like to solve. Let's say you want to manage your trips well. So how about a small website for yourself that would do the same? And you could start with the HTML, CSS part on how it would look like and try to stick to your original design. And that's how you would learn to, sticking to the design, you'll learn how different components work and where to fit different parts inside the website. And if you do not have much of a back-end background, that's okay, because these days online you have like API marketplaces which you can use. Like there's an open source API that you could use to serve your front end. But if you're working in a company and if you want to get started with front end, then I would say pick up an existing project inside the company and probably first read through the project, the coding styles, patterns, and design. So sort of like reverse engineer the front end and get to know what tools they are using and how they're using it. So that way you start with the necessary things first.
Wonderful, wonderful. So being proactive, starting your own projects, and as a manager who's hiring front-end people, we definitely look at that. People who have passion, who actually enjoy what they're doing, it goes a long way in the industry. So perhaps working back this way, Michael, what are your thoughts on this? How can people get started?
I think it's difficult because now the landscape is very fragmented. And we talk a lot about frameworks, for example. But I think it's important to think about the basics. So that's why it's good that Manvi mentioned starting with simple things, because before thinking about frameworks, you have to think about the content you want to deliver. You have to think about the user experience. Even if I run a site called Best of JavaScript, JavaScript is not all the thing about the front-end world, And there are a lot of things that you have to master too. So you have to master how to deliver a document in the browser, but it doesn't mean that you have to think about mastering either React, Vue.js, or Angular, that are the three main frameworks. So I think the difficult part is to pick this right starting point,
Okay.
before diving into a framework.
Wonderful. And Sacha, do you have any advice for picking the right framework?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people spend a lot of time agonizing over that initial choice because they feel like, well, if I pick wrong, then it's over for me, like my whole career is over. But actually, as long as you pick something like relatively, well established and well known, I don't think there's such a big difference between like React or Vue or even something smaller like Elm. I think what's important is being part of a community and kind of, learning step by step and not putting too much pressure on yourself not to make mistakes. So as if let's say I picked React, for example, and I kind of added the pieces bit by bit. So I learned React, and then I looked a little bit at Redux. Then I looked at things like GraphQL and tools around that. But I didn't try to learn all of it at once. And you shouldn't, you should take it easy sometimes and not feel like you have to know everything right from the start. That's my advice, I guess.
Yeah.
Yes, of course, I agree with those statements. And I will just add that if you want to do front-end now, if you are starting now, consider yourself a very lucky person, because if you started like 10 years ago, it was a real nightmare. So now there are a lot of choices you can choose from, but that's a good thing. So if you started before jQuery was alive, when you have to maintain Internet Explorer 5, 6, 7, whatever it was, that was very hard. So now it's wonderful. So you have many choices. There is a great tools out there. The community is very dynamic. You find a lot of new things. Yes, whatever they mention, all those tools, they are just great.
So why Elm?
Well,
does anybody here use Elm? Or do you know Elm? Oh, we have Elm enthusiasts. Well done, thank you. Okay.
Well, related to what I just mentioned, Elm is one of those things that it came out 5, 6 years ago, so it's quite new. But the concept behind Elm, that is a pure functional language, is actually very old. So it's based on lambda calculus that was coming even before a computer was created. I think Elm, it's a different paradigm from object-oriented, so it's a different way, probably compared to what we learn at school, how to write software. But I think it has several benefits, and it's something that it somehow open your mind. So it's something different. It's still, the community is still a bit small, but I think it has a lot of potential. Maybe we will discuss more later.
Cool, thank you. So actually, as one person who used to work 10 years ago with jQuery, IE6 is the bane of my existence, so I relate to that. But actually, you know, React, getting into it is pretty hard. Sacha, do you have any tips for people who are going to learn it from now, who want to start working on the project?
Yeah, I think part of what makes it hard is it's changed a lot over the years. So sometimes you can find material that's outdated, or maybe it teaches patterns that have evolved. Like before, we used to use higher order components. Now we use hooks, which are much simpler. So I think my main tip would be make sure that you learn like the latest way of doing things, and don't worry so much about all the other like past patterns. You can learn those later as you encounter them naturally, but I actually think if you learn React today using new material, it's not that hard and not that complex because it's improved a lot.
Yeah, I think it depends a lot of the point of view you have, because what I love with React is that it's limited to the view layer. So you can say it's very simple, but in the other end, it means that you have a lot of choices to make if you want to build a full application. So some people feel not comfortable with all these choices. That's why React can be sometimes a bit frustrating for newcomers compared to frameworks like Vue.js, for example, who is famous to be maybe a little more user-friendly for newcomers, I would say.
And I guess that leads nicely to Manvi. Angular, Vue, would you like to say something about this?
I would agree with Michael. Like these frameworks could be overwhelming for newcomers, especially, and some of them have a steep learning curve if you want to implement them like really well and like engineer them professionally. But as Michael said, Vue is one of the frameworks which you can get started with in day one. So it's actually based on my personal experience. I had to build something, a website, one web page in like 1 week and in Vue. So day one, I started committing code in Vue. So that was that fast you can get started with it. But yes, the other frameworks do have their importance, and when you're developing enterprise-grade websites, heavy running websites, or which would be like expanding a lot. So these frameworks are quite respectful in the UI world, and they have a reason for that.
Wonderful, thank you. So I think one of the important aspects of a framework, and I would like to talk about state management. And I believe each of these frameworks has a different way of doing that. Perhaps Michael, you could start and give us an idea on React's viewpoint here.
So we talked about Elm recently, just now, and one of the most famous solutions to manage the state in React is called Redux.
Should we explain what state management is?
Please.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, just to
Please.
clarify. So basically how you handle the data available on the client in the browser for your app, as opposed to like how do you load it from the server or data that's internal to a component. So things like Redux, which are kind of managing data at the app level. Is that like a fair explanation?
Yeah, we can say that, yeah. Any web application or mobile application needs a state. We need to store somewhere actions performed by the user or data we got from servers, for example. So the most famous solution in the React ecosystem used to be Redux. And Redux is heavily inspired by Elm, by functional patterns that come from Elm. So the thing is that a lot of things changing in the React world. So as Sacha mentioned, Redux used to be the king, I would say, 2 years ago, 3 years ago. But since new patterns came up in React, especially one called hooks, the result is that you may not need something like Redux, because Redux has an entry cost that is pretty high because you have a lot of boilerplate to create, a lot of wiring to put all things together. So once again, it can be for newcomers a bit difficult to overcome. And that's why, in addition of React, we have a lot of other libraries that compete in this field. So we could mention names like Mobex, for example, that tries to bring a more reactive approach rather than the functional approach of Redux. But still, there is no definitive solution. So that's both the beauty and what is difficult with React. You have to pick your own thing by yourself.
Yes, so maybe I can add something. In Elm, that actually inspired Flux and then Redux eventually, we call it the Elm architecture. That is this flow that is used internally, and we keep the state in the model. We call it like single source of truth because we only have one place where we keep our data. And somehow it's way simpler because we don't have a competition there. In Elm, Elm is one of the philosophy of Elm, like there is only one way of doing things, and that is the good one, possibly. So this is also what the Elm architecture has. The Elm architecture didn't came like in one day. Basically, people were start using Elm for writing a single-page application, and then there was a certain pattern that came out, and they say, okay, why don't we formalize it? And this is how the Elm architecture came out. And basically, is the only choice that you have if you write something in Elm. That's the way to go. Some people who has several 100,000 lines of code, maybe they feel they want to expand on that. But really, for us, now we have an application in Rakuten that is 23,000 lines of code. The Elm architecture is perfectly fine and is working all right. So somehow it's simpler because we don't spend time thinking, okay, wait a moment, maybe we should handle the state differently. No, that's not the case.
Yeah, I agree with you. Like in React, part of the problem is deciding which pattern to use. So like Redux and Mobex, but also just using the local component state, context. And I actually use the URL a lot sometimes because it's state in a way. And I recently had to do like a pretty complex search with filters, and I looked at Redux, I looked at different things, but then I decided just to store all that in the URL, and you can persist that state across sessions like that as well. So I do think sometimes you don't really need something like Redux, and there are simpler solutions available.
I see. I think, yes, for store management Redux, I feel it's more useful when you have like a huge website and you have like a big microservices architecture behind it, and you have like tons of API calls and events happening. And in that case, in such large-scale websites, I feel store management is needed. But in simpler websites, which are smaller and have not that much scope, I think storing it locally or URL is also a good approach. But there are certain limitations to that as well. For URL, sometimes, like how about some sensitive data that you want to store? Like you cannot display it on the URLs, but then you'll have to either store it locally if you're not using store management. In that case, when you're dealing with sensitive data, I feel store management comes in place and could help even in smaller websites.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point from Manvi, because we tend as web engineers to make sometimes overcomplicated choices. We think about state management, we have to pick a library, but often it happens that it's better to use native solutions. So it can be the URL, as you mentioned, because all the web is about sharing URL. So if you can share all your state with a single URL, that's great, because you can share your application state with anyone else. So, and especially with all the new patterns that Sacha mentioned, to like context and so on, you may not need a state management solution. As now, sometimes you can hear, you might not need jQuery, you can do things in a natural way. So it's the same thing for the state management. You can do it in a more natural way. And more natural means easier to maintain too, because it's simpler.
And if you put in a URL, actually you have the browser history, so you can go back in time. That's cool.
Yeah. It's I like using that. Also, there's Apollo. If you are dealing with GraphQL APIs, Apollo now has its own local state management, which kind of does the same thing as Redux. So, yeah, I feel it's interesting to compare all these different approaches that are kind of competing. But I really envy like Elm, where you kind of don't have to decide, and it's just decided for you. So.
Right.
Very, very interesting. So if you want it all laid out for you and one way to do it, go to Elm. If you would like multiple React and these other frameworks would be the way to go. Okay, cool. So it sounds like we've mentioned, I've heard, microservices, backend, Apollo just now, GraphQL. So the front-end engineers, and we're actually very heavy on the engineering side. We haven't really talked about any of the UI or parts of that. Maybe we can cover that a bit later. But sticking with the engineering theme, how much should a front-end engineer be invested in learning about the back-end and tools like GraphQL and back-end as a front-end and stuff? And I think this is a good one for you, Sacha, with the Vulcan framework. This is something that you're actively working on, right?
Yeah, so I define myself more as a front-end engineer, like that's more my background, but I've used a lot of framework called Meteor.js, which is a full-stack framework, and I've also created my own kind of meta framework on top of it called Vulcan. And basically, my goal would be to let front-end engineers also create back-end APIs and simplify or unify both sides, client and server. Because I think a big problem right now is you have to deal with these two completely different environments, and sometimes it's two different people. But even if you have a back-end engineer and a front-end engineer, you still need to understand both sides, I think, a lot of the time. It's hard, even for something like loading data. You need to know where the data is coming from. Do you cache it? And that gets really technical and really complex for a front-end engineer. And on the other hand, even a back-end engineer, if they don't really take the front-end into account at all, there won't be a very good fit between both sides, I think. So, yeah, I don't think today you can really abstract or separate both sides. And ideally, I think everybody should have some grasp of the other side, no matter where their main specialty lies.
I'd like to add on that. So, I feel that if somebody is specializing on the front-end side and on the back-end side, so they should have at least some idea about how the front-end is being consumed if you're on the back-end side, and if you're on the front-end side, then how the back-end will be consumed for the front-end. So when it comes about having like API contracts or what kind of data is going to move around and when and how, I believe that kind of understanding is important. Sorry. Yeah, I believe that kind of understanding is important between the two sides, like to understand the contract and to be able to understand and foresee how the data will flow. Yeah.
And yeah, maybe another point is that the job of front-end developer has changed a lot, because it used to be very simple, I would say 10 years ago, when all we had to do is to use HTML, CSS, and add some JavaScript to make things more dynamic. But now, with the rise of frameworks and single-page application concept, front-end engineers have to deal with a lot of JavaScript and a lot of, I would say, programming concepts that can be very advanced, like functional programming concepts, for example. So it means that now you need a deeper understanding of all the stack, So that's really a big difference, and it can be overwhelming too.
Yes, in my personal case, we have a large team of backend engineer, so we let them do their job, and we do the front end. So we still keep a kind of a separation. I met some engineer when they started using Elm, they kind of fall in love with it, and then they say, "Wait a moment, but if Elm compiled to JavaScript, why don't we use also on the back end running in Node.js?" And some people try to do that, and it's a discussion that came out in the community as well, and it's kind of an interesting one because the other option, I mean, there are not many options if you want to do pure functional programming on the back end. And it's always nice, you know, and JavaScript is one of the powers this right now. It's always nice to be able to use the same language on the front and on the back. Officially, the community of Elm says we don't support the back end. So if you want to do it, do on your own risk. And it's possible you can run Elm inside the Node.js, but of course you will struggle a bit to do all the things that backend does, communicating with file system, databases, and so on. But I know people doing that.
Yeah, so I mean, from my experience when I was started, you know, the JavaScript became more complex as you were trying to add like animations and more fancy kind of decoration on your page. Then the Scriptaculous gave you access to Ajax, and you started getting data, and now it looks like you're programming full applications on the browser, which is pretty exciting. And then, you know, Node, you're extending that into the back end. Very good stuff.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the job description of JavaScript has changed, right? It used to be for showing banners or doing small interactive stuff in a page. Now it's really full-scale apps. So it makes sense that our jobs and the tools we use would change as well, I think.
Mm-hmm. So is there any space for UI design now, or is this another job description? Is this the UI designer who you work next to, or as a front-end engineer, are you expected to be a computer science grad who understands the back end, understands the front end, and has a flair for design?
Yeah, I would say yes.
Yeah, I think the job roles have like blurring lines now. So the more you can do, the better. But yes, some people have their like preferences, and they are more on the artistic side. So they would be dealing with the UI, UX, which is also very important in front end, and like designing the HTML, CSS part. So in some teams, I have seen that we have like special like designers that front end engineers work with. You get the designs, you use tools like Zeppelin and Figma, and like pick up designs from there, and then like translate it into HTML, CSS. And sometimes it's like up to the developer's creativity.
I think maybe one thing that can help is have a style guide, right?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
If you have some good design guidelines, you can, even the non-designers or the more back-end oriented or front-end oriented engineers can improvise in a way. Because I think it's really hard even for a really good designer to anticipate all the use case and all the different states that an app can go through, if there's errors, loading states, empty states.
That's true.
So one of the reasons why I don't like saying that people should have separate jobs is because the designer will do their job and then give off the design, and then the engineer is like, well, okay, but I don't have a design for this thing and that thing and that thing. And they feel kind of stuck because it's not their responsibility. So I prefer when everybody feels empowered to kind of dabble at least in the different fields. And if you have good guidelines and a good communication, I think you can manage, even if it's not your main specialty or your main focus, you can still do your best.
So yeah, this is also like bringing back to the point we were discussing before about how much you should know from front end, back end, and now there's the front part of the front end, which is the UI, UX, and the back part of the front end, which is the frameworks part that we have been discussing about. So the more knowledge we have about at least not exactly implementation, but the working and the how and where it is used, from like whichever side you are on, I think that helps in like building great products fast.
Excellent. Yeah. So I think with with the UI and the way it's growing, multiple screen sizes, devices, we're getting like voice interfaces and stuff. I mean, the UI element is becoming much more complex in this day. Let's talk about like creating a performant. So making sure that the page loads quickly, that it's going to render correctly, that everybody using those different devices has a great experience. And this is something in Rakuten, with a huge service, millions of users, we have to be very careful about that particular person who has that particular old browser, and a lot of effort is put into making the performance well. I'm wondering, do you have any tips, tricks, or things you can share about how we can do that in the modern development world?
A quick heads up, you have 10 minutes left.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's one of the biggest challenges of modern applications, because now with the era of frameworks, we ship more and more JavaScript code in the browser. But it has a huge cost and a huge impact on performances that sometimes people don't realize. Because when you ship, let's say, 50 kilobytes of JavaScript, it's not the same as shipping the same size of an image, because the code has to be parsed and evaluated and then later run by in the browser. So it can lead to bad user experience. So the first tip I would say is, by all means, try to reduce the amount of JavaScript you ship in the browser. So of course, there are a lot of tools. You have to pick your packages carefully. For example, if you use a bundler, you have to check carefully the size of what you bundle. And so that's the first trick, I would say, yeah. By all means, try to reduce the JavaScript size.
Yeah, there are also a lot of chart where you can measure like the performance of different framework. That is also a battle that is happening out there. Again, I don't think for many application that you write, like single page application, those performances are really critical. Like, you know, ordering 10,000 lines of or in a table is not something that we do every day, but there are those graphs out there. You can check, you know, you can compare frameworks and you can figure it out. But at the same time, I also feel that if you adapt a framework, usually the people who build the framework also take care a lot of those things for you. So maybe, again, if you don't build something like a video game or something critical, maybe it's not something that you need to be worried like on a daily basis.
Sorry. Maybe something I would add is that when we talk about performance, it's not just only about raw performance, it's also about user perception. And there are some tricks like something called optimistic UI, sorry. It means that instead of making your app faster, you just trick the user and you anticipate the response from the server. So for example, when you save user information, instead of showing a spinner, a loading spinner on the screen, making the user wait for nothing, you anticipate the fact that, oh, it's going to work, so you go right to the next page, and if it fails, okay, you're going to show a message, but you don't have to make the user wait for anything, any action you perform in the browser. So there are a lot of tricks that need to understand the user experience. So once again, that's why it's not only about the JavaScript skills, it's also about UX skill set.
Right. Yeah, I would just quickly like to add on that. So in Angular, there's lazy loading, which is like one of those tricks. So you have those blurry images when you are scrolling on probably, I don't know if what SNS platforms use it, but in SNS platforms, when you scroll infinitely, and then the images are blurred, but then like after a while, like when you demand them, the images appear. So that's one of the tricks that Michael is probably talking about here right now. So it's called lazy loading in Angular, and probably there are something similar in React maybe, or other frameworks.
Yeah, I think in React it has to be handled manually, or there are libraries to do it, but you have to pick it. But I guess in Angular it's included right in the framework. So once again, it's the same trade-off between full frameworks and smaller libraries like React.
Yeah, but for me, what I struggle with personally is there's often a trade-off between giving a good user experience and sometimes hurting performance, in the sense that, let's say you have a date field, you want a really nice date picker that adds a new library which has its dependencies, and then you want to add animations. You also need a new library. You want to manage your data loading in a good way, cache your data for, to save time. That's also another library. And after a while, like all you wanted to do was build a really good app following all the best practices, and then you look at your package JSON file, and there's like 50 different things, and you're not even sure what they do anymore. So it's really hard sometimes to know where to draw the line and be like, okay, I'm going to sacrifice this date picker, and people will just have to type in the date manually, but at least I will save like 200K or something. It's something I personally always struggle with, and usually I end up adding the date picker anyway. But
you have about 5 minutes left, so if you'd like to wrap things up or have any closing comments, please let us know.
Wonderful, thank you, Rich. Okay, so that was very insightful, thank you. Perhaps you could just go around and give like your top tip, or what you're learning right now. What is the trend that people should be keeping their eyes on? And we'll keep it snappy. Luca, we try to go first.
Yes. So let me spend a few more words about Elm. This is my role today. Well, not only today, I guess, if some of my colleagues is here. So I was mentioning before, this is a good time to be working on the front end because all those new tools. I would add that for the first time in this industry, you can write front end without writing JavaScript, CSS, and HTML. And this is possible using Elm. Let me explain a bit. So if you use Elm, the Elm is a language that compared to JavaScript. So you don't need to write JavaScript, you write Elm as a language. In Elm, there is a library, it's called the Elm UI. It's very cool, and I'm sure they will be probably introduced also in other framework, but for my knowledge now is only in Elm. Elm UI is a framework that you have on top of CSS. So you don't need to write CSS, you write something else. And of course, behind the scene, it will be converted in CSS.
I'm going to jump in there. We can talk about Elm a bit more
later.
After the session.
Okay.
Just in the interest of time.
Okay.
Sacha?
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about Elm, I think. No, but I do really admire that approach of having a more unified way of doing things. And I hope at least that's the future of the rest of the ecosystem as well. I feel for the past couple of years we've developed really, really good individual bricks, but you still have to assemble them together yourself. You still have to do all the plumbing yourself. So I think the next step is something more like IKEA, where you have a kit with instructions that tell you how to assemble those things together. And hopefully we don't have to struggle as much in the next couple of years.
Okay, my turn. So right now I'm very interested in a framework called Svelte that has a concept that is a compiler. So it's a bit similar to Elm, once again, because instead of shipping a lot of code, JavaScript code in the browser, you do a lot of things at compilation time, at build time. So the result is that you can you can ship very small amount of code in the browser, and it has a lot of interesting concepts. So I'm studying this, and I want to learn more about TypeScript too, because there is a huge trend now in the JavaScript world, and more people coming to the safety of static types. So these are my 2 points.
I think I would just say that with all these tools and frameworks around, just keep learning to keep up to date, and not just reading articles on Medium or Stack Overflow, but rather just doing something about it or building some small websites to keep yourself updated. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Wonderful advice from everybody. So I think to just wrap up very quickly what we've heard today, we've heard that if you are starting out and you want to pick a framework which forces you down a certain path and it reduces the complexity for you, pick Elm. If you want to have the full smorgasbord of all of the different frameworks out there, choose React, Vue, or Angular. I think state management we talked about. We heard about various backends, Apollo, Vulcan, built on Meteor, very interesting stuff. Worth learning a bit of the backend so you could increase your scope as a front-end engineer. Working in a bigger team, you're probably going to have back-end engineers, so being able to talk to them and communicate in a professional manner using API contracts and stuff is something for the professional here. We learned some tips to improve the speed of your website, so trying to reduce the amount of JavaScript that you ship, and this really cool idea of optimistic UI, so tricking the user to feel that things are done when they're not actually done. And lazy loading was a good example of this. Very cool. So I think if people want to learn more, definitely check out the Best of JS and the State of JS sites. Also, check out the Vulcan Framework. And Svelte, I think. TypeScript and Svelte look like the new hotness. Sorry?
And try Elm, of course.
And try Elm, of course, yes.
By the way, we will have a conference about Elm next April, and
right.
the author of Elm will come and talk.
Very cool. So I hope we can all go to that one. Wonderful. Everyone, big round of applause to the panel. Thank you.